Welcome to a extra episode of Doesn't Matter. I'm continuing on with the democracy series, but I felt I had to do a brief address of some of the issues that have been occurring in Charlottesville and certainly are relevant to many places in the world right now. The protesters in Charlottesville, the white supremacists, campaigning to keep their revered statues in Charlottesville and as a matter of public record. Though I violently disagree with the values and the reasons that the white supremacists are protesting for, I do agree that the statues of Robert E. Lee and other famous Confederate and Southern politicians and generals shouldn't be torn down for the same reason we shouldn't be tearing the Caesars off their plinths in Rome or tearing down statues of anyone who's been famous in previous histories, because that is a far more dangerous thing to do than to leave them up. You don't have an ideal situation here. People's feelings are going to be hurt either way. But tearing down statues, removing signs of previous history, there are elements of the Berlin Wall that's still been left up. Why were they left up? To remind people they can go there generation after generation and realize that once their country was divided, once it was held in tyranny by the Soviets and people and families were separated, they have deliberately left aspects of the wall up. They've left aspects of the previous, Stasi rule around so that people can remember and never forget the price of freedom, and that people are inherently have short memories when it comes to this kind of thing. We need physical reminders. I sympathise enormously with those people who have had a slave history in the United States and find the statues reprehensible. Sympathise entirely. I'm sure that there have been and there are similar statues and monuments all over the world that Indigenous peoples and oppressed minorities have felt were an insult to their suffering. I think that's a narrow and limited perspective. In fact, I know it is, because I've been subject to racism. I've been subject to extreme prejudice and bigotry in this country, in Australia, and I know that it can tend to, one, engender the same kinds of myopic, bigoted thinking. Bigotry is contagious. But secondly, it can also narrow down your thinking. You become so concerned with whatever's caused you pain that you are unable to look objectively in a more broad sense at what's happening. You become almost addicted to your own perspective. And your perspective is correct. The problem is that the whole topic itself, the whole situation is made up of more than just one perspective, more than your own. You have to be able to see that, or you can't be objective. You can't actually understand what's happening. You're locked in, you're siloed into your own perspective. This happens to racists, and it also happens to people combating racism. It happens, factionalism is a natural inclination of human beings. We're naturally predicated to it. We came from tribes of 30 to 200 at the most. Then we'd fission off into other tribes. We're constantly dealing with the other. And we have some very ingrained, down to the genetic level, inclinations towards bigotry, racism, towards factionalism, classism. All the terrible isms of history come from that origin, that anthropological source. And we've got to be honest about it. If we're not honest about these things, if we tiptoe around them because the PC heads will get mad or the alt-right guys will get mad, we're never going to be able to discuss anything properly and understand who we are and what we are. And I don't give a fuck about people's feelings in comparison to knowing the truth. The truth is always more important than people's feelings. And because we'll never entirely know the truth, we have a almost sacred duty to try and explore it as thoroughly as we can. We will never get all the data. We'll never know, especially when it comes to history. We'll never know everything we need to know. So surely we should be as rigorous as possible in the pursuit of that. I think tearing down statues in any city because it upset, offended, or oppressed a particular group in that city is insane. I understand the feelings behind it, and I sympathise entirely. So to me, those guys, in many respects, to my values, were pieces of shit. But they were also people who were common and normal for that time. And we should remember that once it was normal to own slaves, once it was normal to oppress entire peoples, racism, bigotry, the craniology studies that tried to prove that certain races were dumber than the others by the structure of the skulls, complete bullshit. There was all this stuff arising through the 18th and 19th into the 20th century that were just complete myth, fictions created to justify people's prejudices. We shouldn't forget those things. When you tear down statues and you rewrite books and you know, on the one hand, the same social groups I support that want to bring up aspects of slavery here in Australia, the Aboriginals were actually in chain gangs enslaved. We didn't learn that when Aboriginal studies when I was in school in the 70s and 80s. So that's a good thing. We don't want to tear down evidence, physical evidence of people who were revered and respected at the time, sometimes for good reasons as well as bad, who were responsible for slavery, responsible for the oppression of minorities, were responsible were themselves racist or bigoted in their own ways. We don't want to remove that. We want that in our face. I mean, the truth should hurt sometimes. The truth should be a painful, stick in your craw kind of thing that generation after generation keeps us fucking honest. And trying to wipe the world clean and nerf the world and make it as if it never were the place it is. And that's what I fear with this cultural revisionism and this historical revisionism, is that by trying to change things to suit the existing and a vastly superior narrative, cultural and moral narrative, we're actually going to take the reasons for that away. We're going to weaken the underpinnings of this progress that we've made. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from oppression. It came from suffering. And it came from never forgetting how that happened. I do honestly believe that elements of the left are actually destroying the very foundation of modern progressive thinking, because they're either trying to straitjacket language or rewrite history to suit the existing narrative. The narrative should be supported by history. It should be supported by what we see in history. It should be reinforced in a critical way. Not wiped clean, not revamped, not sanitized to suit our feelings. Look, our feelings are important, but they're less important than the truth. The truth is that these things happen. They will always have happened. Nothing will ever change that, nor should it, because we only got here by the process of actually suffering, fighting, struggling. We found ourselves in this better place. We can lose this better place if we forget how we got here, if we forget the dynamics, the mechanics that got us here. Critical thinking, reasoning, struggle, resilience, and the opposition to those elements enshrined in old guard thinking. If you wipe that out, if you condemn it and then try to forget it, you make yourself vulnerable to it again. Because the lesson that hasn't been learned, the lesson is that anyone can become an oligarch. Anyone can become a class oppressor. Anyone can become the next master, the next slave owner. You give people plenty of money, you give them opportunity to rise above others, you give them leverage, disproportionate leverage over others, you give them superior control of production and capital, and you watch what happens to a lot of people. They become the very thing that had its boot on their neck. They become the boot wielders, the crushers, the baton wielders. That's the lesson. We're all quite capable of becoming the monsters that we fear. And the only way that ever changes is by a recognition of that status. And the only way we fight the prospect of a return to those regressive, brutal values is by remembering how we got here. And those statues in Charlottesville, I believe, are an important reminder I think the protesters should have gone there and had vigils at those statues yearly or more, where they remember and celebrate the end of the values of these men, of these oppressors. Turn it round. Don't try to tear it down. Remember it in all its brutal honesty and celebrate what we have now. And celebrate what can be done now to improve our status further still. It's, for me, a sensitive subject because, as I've said, I've been subject to a fair bit of racism here in Australia. And it's just it's a feature of our humanity. And once you accept that, it becomes a lot less personal. And it becomes much more of an existential collective problem, an anthropological issue, a conundrum that we can solve, rather than a personal assault on your feelings. As soon as we bring ourselves too much into the matter, we get the ego steps in, we get in our own way, and our thinking starts to degrade. We become less able to think clearly and to solve these problems. All right? I think that the Charlottesville protests, the supremacists had a right to protest the removal of the statues. They didn't have a right to come there armed for bear, drive cars into crowds, beat the fuck out of people, most of whom were not armed. Yeah, I'm sure there were some left-wing agitators there always are. But most of the anti-fascist protesters there were not anywhere near prepared for the kind of reception they got. The white supremacists came for trouble. They found trouble and they made trouble. And there's no excuse for what they did. All right? The underlying issue, however, is that they had a valid reason to protest. And they turned it into a shitfest because they couldn't separate their valid reason from their racism, from their hatred. And they took it out on innocent people there. And they inspired hatred in other people too, which has done no one any service. But that's another podcast. Thanks very much.